Join us next week for Chapter 9, Where Crocodiles Wear Gold. To show your support for the podcast, please follow and tell your friends about it. See you soon. Early morning saw the children once again assembled around the pond in what they hoped was Egyptian garb. Sam was wearing shorts under his toweling skirt so that he'd have a pocket to carry the stone in. Maylie was draped in one of Auntie Sue's white T-shirts, gathered at the waist with a small leather belt. The boys had hand towels pinned around their waist and wore a black and blue T-shirt. Jane wore a tight-fitting dress which had hieroglyphics printed on the material. She'd had an argument with the boys about wearing it. They teased, insisting it was dangerous to wear hieroglyphs which you could not read. For all we know, it could say something insulting, Peter said, like, Temenhut is a twerp, or Donald Duck for Pharaoh, said Sam. More likely they're not even proper hieroglyphics, Jane said crossly. Anyway, this dress is the perfect style. See here. And she showed them some pictures on the internet of Egyptian dresses. She was privately a bit more worried about the fact that the skirt was long and tight. Hopefully she would not have to run for it in ancient Egypt. After retrieving the stone, they trailed up the disappearing hill. There was some argument as to the wording of the Egyptian time travel wish, but eventually Sam carried the day. Let's just go to the time of Temenhut. Once we get there, we can find out if he's the ruler and what the story is, okay? The others nodded, and with all of them holding hands, Sam said, I wish we were all four in Egypt at the time of King Temenhut. During past trips, the children had often had to do quite a bit of walking and searching before they found the person, place, or thing they had gone back in time to see. This time, they landed bang in the middle of what looked like a crazily busy farming village or town. They were standing in a small clump of trees which looked onto a big, wide road, skillfully paved with large stone blocks. Different kinds of palm trees grew in neat rows and clumps all over. The road was thronged with pedestrians, laden donkeys, and people pulling hand carts. It was noisy. There was talking and shouting, trotting donkeys' hooves, the bang of herds of sheep and goats, rumbling carts, and the calls of food sellers shouting their wares. The air was dusty, and the children blinked as a couple of passing carts threw up fine clouds which made their eyes gritty and caused Jane, who had allergies, to sneeze. They started to walk slowly down the street. Then, as they turned a corner, all stopped abruptly. In the distance, where the main street disappeared as it dipped downhill, they saw the top of a massive white pyramid which glittered and shone in the sun. It looked like it was sending light rays up to the sun rather than the other way around. They stood looking at it in silence and wonder. I've seen pictures of pyramids, Sam said, but they never look like that. It looks like it's giving off light. I read that the pyramids used to be covered in polished white limestone, Jane said. The limestone's been stripped off and stolen or sold and reused, so the pyramids you see today in our world are missing the outer layer. I guess that's what we're looking at. It's beautiful, Maylie said. Do you think that's Temenhut's pyramid? Sam asked. It should be, Jane said. That's what we asked the stone for. Come on, let's go closer and see. They started to walk slowly and rather timidly along the road which led towards the towering pyramid, looking with great curiosity at the bustling activity all around, but trying not to attract attention and to look as if they knew where they were going. They were feeling increasingly self-conscious as their T-shirts and hairstyles did not blend in. The boys felt particularly embarrassed about their towel skirts, which stood out in their knobbly whiteness. The roads, lanes, and paths they passed were set out in an orderly grid and ran in straight lines past clusters of rectangular mud brick houses. Some were small and single-storied, while others had rather crooked-looking second stories or roof verandas. They all had flat roofs, mainly thatched with palm leaves, small square windows, and narrow doors. The doors and shutters on the windows looked rather flimsy, and Peter told them they were probably from the papyrus plant, a reed-like plant which grew in marshy areas and which was also used to make paper and rope. They saw a bakery, a stonemason, and what they guessed was a weaver's, as a large number of women were sitting under a palm leaf shelter spinning. Surrounding the town were red-orange hills, devoid of any scrap of green, a reminder that the town was surrounded by desert. The children looked with interest at the passing men, women, and children. Most of the clothes were made from a rather coarse beige linen, made from the flax plant, Jane remembered reading. But some of the smarter dressed people wore red. Jane pointed to a man in a smart red tunic riding a donkey and said, "Guess what the Egyptians used to make red dye from?" "What?" Maylie asked. "An insect, a tiny scale insect." "I wonder how they caught enough to make it," Maylie said, and Jane shrugged. "I don't know. Glad that's not my job, though." Many of the men were bare-chested, some with short skirts which were cunningly twisted and folded and tied with belts and decorative tassels threaded with beads. The women wore a variety of short and long dresses, some of which looked strangely modern in style. The younger children were naked or wore small wraps around their waists. It was particularly hard not to stare at the hairstyles of the boys and men, which were, as Peter said, far out. Some had their heads shaved back and sides, with only a small ring of hair left on the top of the head, and from some of these patches hung ringlets or a number of thin plaits. Some of them had completely shaved heads, apart from one long plait of hair which hung down from above one ear and gave them a rather lopsided look. "I never checked hairstyles," Jane said. "Oh, well, you're okay, Maylie, and Peter's mop is okay-ish. I think Sam and I need to cover our hair, though. People are staring." "I know. Lots of people have turbans on. Let's wrap the spare towels around our heads." Sam, who was carrying the towels, handed them out, and they tried to wrap them in a style similar to the turbans they saw around them. Even this did not help much, however, and everyone they passed stared hard at them, even turning around to look after them. "I'm sweating," Jane muttered. "Me too," Peter said. "This is pretty stressful." "How are we going to find out anything about the stone in Temenhut when everyone is staring at us?" Sam said. "We can go home any time, and if people stare but don't stop us, we're okay," Peter said. "Let's try and find a quieter street, though." The children headed away from the main street until they found a quiet, broad farm track which led between fields of wheat and barley. There was no chance of getting lost. The white pyramid towered to the right of them, gleaming dazzlingly in the sun, getting larger and more imposing as they got closer. As they walked, they glanced curiously up and down all the roads they passed. The Egyptians were clearly clean farmers, and the children saw large numbers of sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and large flocks of geese in fields and pens. "It's not as hot as I expected," Sam observed. He'd been expecting a searing desert heat, but although it was certainly very warm, it was not uncomfortably so. "Yes, it's actually cooler than at home in the Karoo," Peter said. "But the sky is the same," Jane said. "African blue." The sand, which had been the same ruddy colour as the surrounding desert hills, had been changing colour as they walked, becoming darker until it was almost black. "This looks like really good, rich farming soil," Sam said, with the eye of a farmer's son. "Yes," Peter agreed. "And you know what? I think this is the silt that you always read about that got deposited by the flooding of the Nile River each year. All the Egyptian civilizations were founded on the farming that was made possible because the Nile flooded and brought all this incredibly fertile soil. The rest of Egypt is basically a desert. So that means that firstly, we are very close to the Nile, and secondly, we must be here sometime in December, or maybe January or February, because I read that the Nile floods during June to September, and the crops we've passed are quite well grown, so it must be quite some time after September." "Sherlock Holmes," Jane said, and they all looked at Peter with respect. The children continued to walk towards the big pyramid. Peter's theory that they were close to the Nile was confirmed when the children found a strongly flowing irrigation channel. The water was greenish and had a strong and not particularly nice smell. This was probably, Peter told them, because the Nile was a one-stop shop for washing clothes, watering crops and animals, for bathing and drinking, and for serving as a toilet. After panting up the slopes of a small but steep hill, they were rewarded by a view of the actual Nile, which all found quite thrilling. From their vantage point, they could see over the flat-roofed houses of the town to the impressively wide blue river, the longest in the world. It flowed slowly past the far side of the town, its banks bordered by a broad green oasis of fields and farmlands, beyond which lay the desolate sands of the Sahara Desert. The huge glittering pyramid grew in majesty as they got closer. "It's almost scary," Sam commented. "Yes, it feels kind of magical," Peter agreed. "I'm glad we didn't bring the camels," Jane said, as they passed a field with 4 grazing donkeys. "They would have attracted even more attention than the towels and the modern haircuts. I've only seen donkeys and those small carts being pulled by goats." "Yeah, I noticed that," Sam said. "Not what I expected either. I thought it would be Camel City here." "Probably only the rich people have camels and horses," Peter said. "Or perhaps this is too early on for them to be common. Remember that Temenhut was one of the very early Egyptian kings in the time Professor Gamal called the Old Kingdom." As he was speaking, they mounted the top of a hill which lay at the end of the long dirt road they'd been following. In front of them lay a flat plain fringed by desert hills. At the foot of the hill on which they stood, quite a way below them, was a long avenue stretching for about half a kilometre. It led in a dead straight line towards the centre of the pyramid, which they could now see in its majestic entirety. The avenue was lined with brightly painted columns which supported a white marbled roof. Surrounding the pyramid were a large number of buildings, large and small. The 2 largest immediately caught the attention, as they too were spectacular. They were built side by side and were unusual in that the walls were slightly sloped inwards, so that the base of the building was wider than the top. In the facade of one of the buildings, set into alcoves along the entire front, were massive stone figures painted in brilliant colours. "Do you reckon those are temples?" Sam asked. Peter nodded. "Looks like it. Let's go closer and check them out. Look at that massive black and white one. I can't exactly see what it is, but it's gigantic." They descended the hill and stopped some distance off. The figures which fronted the one temple were identical, except for the big cone-shaped headdresses. They stood with imperiously folded arms, their brightly painted eyes staring watchfully across the plain towards the town. The other temple had 6 massive columns, 3 on each side, and in the middle, as if guarding the dark entrance, stood a huge statue. As they got closer, they saw it was the jackal-headed god Anubis. He held a scale in one hand, and the other arm, which was crossed over his chest, held a huge amulet. "He's scary," Maylie said, shuddering. "Anubis is the god that weighs the heart when someone dies," Peter said. "He weighs the heart against a feather from the goddess Maat." The children giggled at this, as the word Maat meant friend in Afrikaans. "You wouldn't laugh if he was weighing your heart," Peter said. "The ancient Egyptians believed that if you lived an evil life, your heart would have become heavy with the badness. If your heart was heavier than the feather when Maat weighed it, you would not be allowed to enter the afterlife and would be eaten by the monster Ammit. It's because the heart was so important that they left it in when they are mummifying someone. Although they took out the other things like the brains, which they removed through the nose with a sharp hook, and the stomach, liver, kidneys." He tailed off as he heard Sam mutter, "Spoiler alert," and noticed that the girls were looking rather horrified. They stood in silence looking at the strange scene. To the right, in the distance, threaded the Nile. To the left of the pyramid and temples were a number of smaller, simpler buildings, 2 of which were under construction. A large number of men toiled around them. A huge stone was being pulled up a long ramp on a rope pulley pulled by 8 powerful-looking men. "It looks like they're using wooden poles under the stones to roll them," Sam said, squinting. "That's neat." "So what are we going to do?" Jane asked impatiently, not interested in building techniques. "Go to the pyramid or the temples?" "Well, if Temenhut has died, the pyramid will be closed up," Peter said thoughtfully. "As far as I know, they built the pyramid while the kings or pharaohs were alive, and then sealed the mummy in and filled it with everything they would need in the afterlife when they died." "So we can go and find out if he's alive or dead by looking at the pyramid?" Jane asked. "I guess." "I think we should try and get inside the pyramid," Sam said. "See what we can find out about Temenhut and the stone." They didn't dare go down the fancy avenue, so instead followed a dusty footpath which led to the pyramid entrance. There they found rows of soldiers, standing in front and holding huge spears. Their brown gladiator broad chests were bare, and they wore the usual short skirts, and, rather oddly, red pillbox-like caps which reminded Jane, who'd flown overseas, of those worn by air hostesses. Like the beef eaters outside Buckingham Palace, they stood dead still, staring straight ahead, their legs slightly apart, feet forward. They looked dangerous. A small marble building attached to the pyramid was still being built, and they decided that this meant Temenhut must still be alive. Intimidated by the staring soldiers, they headed off towards the entrance of one of the temples, but a man in a white turban and long gown came out and shouted at them fiercely. Alarmed, they turned and walked swiftly away. "What do you think his problem is?" Peter asked, as they darted up a path which led past a small settlement of houses. "I don't know. Maybe only adults are allowed in. Or we dress wrong," Sam suggested. "What do we do now?" "Why don't we try again when it's dark?" Jane suggested. "Maybe they won't close them up at night. We can sneak in when everyone's gone." "That's a good idea," Peter said. "Let's walk down to the Nile for now and chill out of sight until sunset." The children made their way in the direction of the river, bypassing by one of the buildings which were under construction. Some children, similar in age to Jane and the boys, were kneeling on the sand by some rocks, playing some throwing game. "What are they playing?" Melly asked. Their voices made one of the children look up. He nudged the child next to him, and one by one they stopped the game and stared in open curiosity at the 4 children. One of them said something, and they all burst out laughing. "Rude children," Jane said, highly offended. "Come on, let's go to the Nile." And the children walked quickly away, trying to look like they didn't care about the mocking laughter which followed them until they were out of sight. Please join us next week for Chapter 9, Where Crocodiles Wear Gold. To show your support for the podcast, please follow and tell your friends about it. See you soon.